What's up, guys? Homeless Plumber here. I wanted to do something a little bit different today and just kind of do some commentary off the dome with some of my own gameplay in the background. Kind of talking about what I enjoy in roguelites and what I think makes them unique as a genre, but more so speaking within the genre, as in like what makes each game unique and what makes them great or good or mediocre or, anywhere in between. I think there's a couple main vectors of randomness and variety that roguelites can offer. And I think the name of the game is, of course, variety, though you can't discount a game just because, oh, well, you can only play it for, 20, 40 hours. Like, that's still a considerable time investment by comparison to most games. But I understand most of the roguelite fans out there are looking for something, 150 hours plus, potentially. Um, so I kind of want to talk about how games can achieve that, and I think the main vectors of this, in which they can achieve this, is okay. Primarily, character variety or class variety, environmental slash enemy variety, which I think play into each other pretty heavily. Enemy variety is a big one, I think, and then also items, upgrades, and the functionality of the character. Guns in Gungeon, upgrades in Isaac, pedestal items, active items, etc. Cards, Slay the Spire, of course. So I kind of wanted to go through a couple games and talk about how they achieve different things that you couldn't put into one and just transplant over, and how there's a little bit of uniqueness where you can't really make the ideal roguelite because the strengths of one would be the weaknesses of another. So what I was thinking about when I initially thought of the idea for this video is something like Slay the Spire versus something like Risk of Rain 2. Risk of Rain 2 is, for all intents and purposes, very random and very chaotic. Of course, you can manage most runs, I think. Maybe not, max difficulty, but you could certainly do Monsoon on any run if you're skilled enough. But generally speaking, you're relying on item synergies. If you get 13 bustling funguses, you're not going to be a happy camper, even if you're engineer. Then, you look at something like Slay. And Slay is significantly less random, I think. There's less stages, partially due to a lack of DLC, but there was more stages for Risk Rain 2 initially as well. But that's not its decided source of randomness. Slay the Spire is much more straightforwardly focused, I would say. I think that its goal is not to be the hyper random game. Its goal is to bring variety through a drafting system, but it's not trying to do a million things at once. The way I would describe Slay, and I think the way that you could best describe it, would be predictable outcomes in unpredictable circumstances. Now, what I mean by that is that your actions have predictable outcomes moment to moment, action to action. However, you're placed in unfamiliar circumstances or there's varying combinations of enemies. You might have to face several combats in a row in a way that you don't have to in most runs, and maybe you have to plan ahead for that. A lot of the skill of the game is drafting a deck that can compensate for the weaknesses of its strengths, you know. And a lot of games don't give you that much agency in creating your build. Of course, Slay still has a large amount of randomness. If you play the Silent enough, you know that you can hardly ever get Catalyst on A20, or at least not early enough where it makes sense to build into Poison without it. But I think that it's not an unfair level of randomness, and there's a lot of ways to react to what the game is giving you. And I think that's the mark of a good game and why it has so much staying power. By comparison to that, think about a little bit more action-based games. Because when you look at Slay, what you're looking at is the whole game is essentially drafting and reacting, right? Not in a Twitch, super high intensity way, but just reactive gameplay, essentially. When you look at something like Isaac or Dead Cells or whatever, name your favorite action roguelike, Hades, there's a lot more room to be experimental, and that's in large part due to the fact that you can compensate for randomness with mechanical skill. Everybody has won all of these games with no items, with no guns other than the starter one, etc. And that's something that you really can't do in Slay. You're not going to be beating the max difficulty with, the starter deck taking no cards, because that's not what the game is about. The game is the card build, the deck building. And that's a fairly specific statement to make, specific to Slay. Of course, it applies to a lot of deck builders. Like, you can do Jokerless Balatro runs. They're hard, but planets are very strong, and there's a lot of ways to deck fix. In my opinion, Balatro is considerably more random than Slay, simply because there's more bosses that directly shut down your build. Like, I've beaten A20 Silent with a Shiv build going against Timekeeper. So it's not like you can't overcome those things. Balatro is kind of like, debuffed face cards, anti-8. You're not necessarily going to be able to win. You're not going to be able to pivot. Of course, that's a deck building issue early on, but really sometimes the timing is just too much. You're not bulletproof. But at the same point in time, less of that scaling relies on the jokers. There's more play to be had. If you can invest heavily into one hand or one suit or two suits or multiple strategies at once, you might be, struggling on hand to hand, but you might be able to, split the difference and win two bosses in a row that a more focused build couldn't, right? The same thing applies to Slay somewhat, but I think I would describe Balatro as rolling with the punches, and I would describe Slay drafting to the optimal degree. That being said, of course, Balatro runs can boil down into playing high card over and over again. So theoretically, the mechanical gameplay, or however you want to state it, the combat to combat gameplay can become basically redundant at a certain point. Whereas Slay, generally, it's still very interactive. Or it feels interactive, even if you can win on turn one of a boss fight or a combat. It feels like you're interacting with the enemies to do that, and like you're planning it all out ahead of time. Mentioning some action roguelites, I'd mentioned before that you don't rely as heavily on the RNG elements to win the game. For example, if you look at Spelunky versus Isaac, Spelunky is much more skill-based. It is raw skill. Same thing with Descenders. Descenders, you really can't get around being mechanically good at the game. You can make it a little bit softer or more forgiving, but at the end of the day, if you're trying to win, it's going to be up to you to play through it. Isaac, on the other hand, you can just get a ridiculous build. There's other games like this, but it's the same thing with Risk of Rain 2, as I've said before. Same thing with Tiny Rogues. But that's not to the detriment of the game. A game being high mechanical skill moment to moment, which, by the way, these games also can be. It's just that they have the potential for more broken runs. But the randomness and broken potential of a lot of these things play to the strengths of games like Risk of Rain, like The Binding of Isaac, in a way that they wouldn't for more focused things like Slay or like Into the Breach. Like, of course, all of these games have randomness, but the way that it's presented and the way it's given to you is different. For example, moving into a couple of my key tenets here, environmental and mission variety, I feel is something that Into the Breach is very good at, even though it doesn't have a lot of alternate zones, I guess. It's just that the way that you play with the environment means that any small change to it becomes significant, much more significant than it would be in other games. Whereas, for example, Isaac, there's hundreds and hundreds of different room layouts and different, alternate floors and stuff. But generally speaking, you don't have to play that differently for most of the rooms. Of course, there's trap rooms and there's different enemy combinations and there's plenty of variety, but it doesn't fundamentally change how you have to face the enemies, because you're not defending something like Into the Breach. Your goal is to kill, and the way that you kill might be different, but it doesn't change from like, oh, maybe I need to kill. Oh, maybe I need to just focus on defense. Maybe I can get away with grabbing this thing while the room's out. Of course, there's exceptions to this, and that's part of the reason that Isaac is so great. Is that, like, for example, if you're playing Keeper or Tainted Keeper, like, you do have to play that mini game of managing your health and having to pick things up. But yeah, environmental variety, Slay isn't the best at it, but that's not its strength. Hades 2 is a very good example of both a good and kind of bad way, in my opinion, to do it. It's a very thematic, story heavy game. So I understand why they split the above ground and below ground. Like, if you don't know, there's two different paths, up and down. Um, so there's essentially two different runs that you can do, and you kind of have to do multiple of each to complete the story. But it's really interesting and it's really fun. But once you've beaten each one, a lot of times, firstly, the difficulty does not match up between the two. So by the time you're end game and you have meta progression, going below ground is not great unless you set the heat higher, going down or whatever it's called. I don't know. Heat is Hades 1, but when the difficulty doesn't match up, it feels less rewarding than going to Olympus. But it works out very well for Hades 2, and it makes it a more enjoyable experience. However, I think most games, as opposed to having two paths, should just have alternate floors that can be mixed and matched or opted into, like Isaac or other games where, I think Absolem, the newer one, has that as well, where you can kind of go on the hard route. Same thing with Risk of Rain 2, same thing with Spelunky, I think, has the alternate stages and stuff. But yeah, I think that's the best way to do it, generally speaking. But, there's a exception to every rule. Speaking a little bit of enemy variety, which is kind of like tied into it pretty heavily, I'm okay with recolors. I'm okay with reused enemies. I'm okay with bosses becoming enemies, as long as it just adds to the game and it's not in place of other content. And kind of what I mean by that is, I'm a big ARPG player. And in my mind, if you don't know, it's like Diablo, Path of Exile, stuff like that. In my mind, I'm completely okay with the reuse of assets. Hell, even Elden Ring is a big offender of this. Not that it's an offense necessarily, but I'm okay with the reuse of assets because, generally speaking, a lot of the basic enemies are very similar when you're just mowing through them, right? It becomes a little bit different when you get into a roguelite because your power level is less consistent, and it feels like you should have some reactivity to the enemies and they should have a little bit of variety. That being said, there has to be chaff monsters, and they can totally just be recolors all the time with slightly different effects or whatever. But I don't think most roguelites are bad about it. I just think that it's you have to be a little bit careful. For example, if you're a Destiny player, you'll know that the last DLC was essentially just a reskin of the Fallen for Destiny 1, that is. Enemy variety is a big thing. Like, for example, God of War 1. Oh my gosh, God of War 1. Awful enemy variety. I I appreciate the game's story. I like it and everything. I like the classics. I think Ragnarok is really good. One of the most abysmal enemy variety that I've seen in a game, that is that loved. And, it has other strengths, and, Slay doesn't have the most enemy variety either. Isaac obviously has a lot, but it's a lot of variants. It's a lot of the same thing. It's a lot of recolored flies. It's a lot of recolored Isaacs. And, it's thematic and it makes sense. And there's different gameplay variety. And I don't mind when things aren't that visually different, as long as I can tell what they're meant to do. That being said, everyone enjoys a little bit of visual pizzazz. Side note, one thing I really enjoy is your items appearing on your characters. I find it very annoying when it doesn't. I understand the limitations of it. Like, for example, I don't expect Gungeon to have that. Enter the Gungeon. It makes sense. It's not a big enough model. There's not enough real estate. You're meant to have a relatively compact model because it's a bullet hell. Hades has kind of an interesting workaround to this, where it's boons. It's not physical items. But I can't say it doesn't bother me when I get a pair of shoes and the pair of shoes is not on my character. Of course, Risk of Rain 2 is the the king of this. That being said, of course, there's games where you don't want everything to be quite as goofy. But I appreciate it, and I think it's a nice feature for most roguelites. I think most roguelites don't take themselves that seriously. Speaking of Risk of Rain 2, it's designed with the thought in mind that you're supposed to get to the insane power creep levels, and it's supposed to be sprinting around at a million miles per hour, automatically killing things. And that's okay. That's wonderful. You have games that, run the gamut where it's very much lower to the ground. Curse of the Dead Gods, Spelunky, like I mentioned earlier, Raven Watch. It doesn't get that ridiculous, really, but it works to its strength. And even Risk of Rain 1 is a much more reserved, more calculated step-by-step game for the most part. It doesn't get quite to the break levels as quickly, in my opinion. Although, that's like a difference. I haven't played it as much, so I know that you can get there, and I have looped on it and stuff, and I know it can get ridiculous, but if a game has one-shot protection, that tells you all you need to know about how ridiculous the enemy damage scaling gets later on, really. Moving on, though, I want to talk about item variety a little bit. One game I mentioned that has it in low amounts, or I guess I should say items, boons, equipment, whatever you want to call it, right? Bonuses, perks, passives, right? Again, I kind of want to continue the trend of mentioning that like it's not a bad thing to not have this as the main form of variety. Like my brother loves the game Descenders, and I think I mentioned it earlier. It's primarily environmental variety. There's not a lot of there are options for passives and stuff, but primarily you're downhill mountain biking, and it is a highly mechanically focused game. It is not a game where you can just substitute skill for a broken build. Of course, there's things that make it more forgiving, but there's really no substitute for playing well. And it's probably one of the games that would be the easiest to do without perks if you're good at the game. Other than like there's some where it's kind of required, like fall distance and stuff, where like you'll just die if you're going too fast. But anyway, that being said, you don't need item variety, but it's one of my favorite vectors of randomness and replayability, partially coming from Isaac, where it's the main game changer. Of course, it has its downsides, like the bloat of the item pool, not really being able to understand what each thing does uniquely. It feels like a lot of things are kind of side grades or substitutes for the exact same item. Like, for example, of course, everyone would point to basic HP upgrades, right? But look at the game and think how many items are health with damage, health, flat tier up, or effects that are even more specific, like spectral tiers or something. There's 20 plus items that do each of these things. They're just like that one thing. I know that it's not quite that high, but I'm just saying that there's a lot of items that fall into buckets and are essentially just the same item and with different faces. And I appreciate that. I want the items to have different faces. I think it's cool. And I think it works for Isaac, but it feels a lot worse in other games when the item pool is bloated. Like even in Risk of Rain 2, there's some bloat with the item pool where it's just like med kits versus like the monster tooth necklace or whatever. There's cases where they essentially feel the same to get. Some are more generically useful, but it's not necessarily a bad thing to have side grids, but I think the heart of variety is having unique effects that make you go, ooh, wow. Like Brimstone, if you don't know, it's a huge blood laser in Isaac. Usually you're shooting tears. It's crazy. Tech, it's lasers instead of tears. Tiny Planet, it makes them orbit you. You can get Reaper Scythes tiers, you can get huge Mongo tiers, you can get super fast ones, you can get charge up, you're like vomiting chocolate milk and stuff. Like, it's crazy. There's a bunch of different stuff. Like, those are the most exciting items, but it's also important to have just, basic stat ups, because they make the gameplay a little bit smoother, and they also allow for certain builds to work better. Like, not having a damage up with more basic tiers is kind of annoying. Whereas, something like Brimstone will generally function without damage or whatever. But then, like, you want movement speed, you want tiers for charge speed, etc., Or like range is a dead stat for Brimstone, but it's quite good if you have tiers orbiting you, or you have them infinitely running through the walls. If you have the there's a variety of situations. Large rooms, it's pretty useful. I think one that's really cool is Astral Ascent. I haven't seen many people talk about the game, but you can customize your spells a lot, and there's a lot of different ways to customize your character. Maybe too much, which for me it's not, but it does feel a little bit bloated sometimes. It's definitely not as focused, but runs usually don't get as crazy either. Like, it is moment to moment skill, but very in depth build crafting, which I do enjoy a lot. Dead cells by a difference. The weapons feel very unique, many of them, and the combos feel very unique, and you don't need a lot of passives to set that up. You can mostly rely on the interaction between the weapons themselves, and that's cool. I like that. Though I do love having a lot of passive items. Synthetic too. Actually, I think this is a good spot to talk about class variety a little bit, kind of wrap up on this. Synthetic 2, I've been playing recently. A good friend of mine got it for me for my birthday, and it is very good in terms of class variety, in my opinion. Class / character variety. It gives customization within the classes, and this is kind of something to talk about with. I'm going to again point out that games don't have to have good class variety to feel good. Balatro is one where a lot of the decks don't play that different. There's differences, but generally speaking, by the time you hit mid game, the decks aren't going to play that differently. Generally, it's more of an early game setup, and you can kind of just play like gold deck, which is just kind of generically powerful. That being said, you can craft around them, but like that's not really a massive part of the game unless you're just playing for completionists and stuff. It's much more important the things that you find in your run, and I think that's basically true of all of roguelites, really. But Synthetic 2, you get to choose your starting weapon, and it's still very important to find weapons. But your general game plan is determined pretty heavily by your class. Like Recon is very good at stealth and weak point hits. Speaking of which, a very unique mechanic to Synthetic 2 is that you can get headshots in a top-down isometric game, which is very cool. But regardless, that plays into the Recon mechanic, and then you have like a knife wielding crazy guy, and then you have a explosives expert that can like re-explode explosions. You have a drone guy, etc. It's pretty fun. Raven's Watch is also exceptionally good at class variety. I guess I should mention Dead Cells is not class variety, but that's not bad. It's just that's not what the game is about. It's about your equipment, right? It's not about playing different characters. It's mostly skins as opposed to different characters. But yeah, Raven's Watch, all the characters play very different. They have unique mechanics. You have Little Red Riding Hood who transforms into she has a shotgun and she transforms into a wolf at nighttime, and there's a day-night cycle and stuff that plays into that, which is really cool. But then you also have like an Aladdin type character that can wish. His ultimate is wishing, and it has limited charges, but it has like very unique effects and multiple effects that you can choose from. And that is honestly one of my favorite ways to accentuate randomness. Of course, you have Slay with like decks and stuff as well, with like Ironclad Silent, etc. Defect Mystic, and I can never remember the last one's name. Watcher. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to talk about how there's different kinds of variety, and it's not necessarily bad that every game doesn't have all of the variety. And games should kind of play to their strengths, whether or not they're strategic games, in which case I think that build variety and environmental variety can be the most important, whereas like action games, items can be the most important, or characters. And there's different ways to do it, and there's different ways to combine them all. Some games, it's almost entirely just, what am I seeing? What am I reacting to? I mentioned Descenders, I mentioned Spelunky. The gameplay is very similar every time, but it's reactive. Yeah, so I just kind of wanted to wrap that up with that. Also, you may notice that I have a new microphone, graciously donated by the Jafta Foundation. And let me know if there's any audio issues or anything. I think it comes out sounding pretty good. A lot better than recording on my phone, I think. Although I still need to learn better how to like clean up audio and stuff. So you might hear a little bit of background noise in this one, but let me know. And we actually have a special guest appearance today for the Pawsitivity segment. He will be taking over from here. And I would like to point out, if anyone would like to, if you've made it to this point in the video and you would like to leave comments for the next Pawsitivity, I think I'm going to start including nice positive comments or whatever in that as part of it if I don't do like a whole spiel at the end. So leave a positive statement, not necessarily towards me or anything, just, something that you think people should hear, something that people would enjoy hearing, But anyway, James, take it away.
Hello, as forementioned, this is James. I'm Homeless Plumber's brother. Now it's time for a little Pawsitivity. Whether you're watching or listening to this video, let's try something together. Close your eyes. Now think of a person that matters to you. A friend, family member, partner, whoever you want. Now think about why that person is important to you. Now here's the fun part. After the video, give that person a call, send them a message or a letter, let them know how you feel. I guarantee you'll feel happier after. I'm going to pick my brother, especially since he has to edit this video, so he'll have to hear this 40 times. If you weren't my brother, you'd still be my best friend. You're a great son to our mom, and I'm proud of you. And I am proud that you are my brother. And anybody who wants a little extra credit and maybe a shout out on next video, leave a comment below saying who you think means something to you and why. Then send them this video so they can see. We are all people. We are all equal. Peace.